Alright, we're on our next introduction video, so we're still going over very foundational things. And today we're going to be talking about the geography of Europe. As you can see here, you have a physical map of Europe, and this is what, from a satellite view from space, of what Europe looks like. You'll be taking your map quiz on Europe of the modern day boundaries, political boundaries. It's important to kind of like keep what you're learning in this lecture in mind and understanding how does geography relate to what we're studying in the history of Europe. Okay, so let's talk about the relationship between history and geography. Well, if we were to define history, simply it's the experiences humans have over time. Okay, so over time humans have different experiences depending upon where they're living, when they're living, and all these experiences have to take in a geographic place. And so geography is very much tied into history because that's where the people are. And so geography is going to describe the Earth, in our class specifically Europe as the continent, but we're really going to look at how do humans interact with the environment that they're in. If the environment changes for whatever reason, whether it's climate or physically, right? Let's say the sea level is higher or lower. How do humans react to that? Okay, so geographic differences, of climate is going to be one of the major ways that we can see it will change throughout Europe. For example, the plants and animals from certain regions are only found in certain parts of the world. Okay, so in the Middle East and in Europe, there is the production of wheat, but in Asia they don't use much wheat, but they focus on rice, right? As we can give credit to. Also in the Americas, they use maize, which is like a corn, right? In Asia, that's where horses originated, right? About 4,500 years ago, and that was used for muscle power, right? For farming, agricultural, but also used for transportation and also fighting. And later it would transition over to Europe, and that wouldn't be found as many in other continents. So with these differences, they were very distinct to that region until obviously we begin trading, and that's where travelers are going across the great oceans and seas, and they're taking these plants, they're taking these seeds, they're taking these animals, and they're bringing them to new environments. And if they do, if they are sustainable in that climate, in that environment, then they will thrive. If not, then they will not survive, right? Okay, so pretty straightforward and simple that climate and environment dictates kind of the things that are coming out of it. So cartography is the art and science of map making, and though Europeans were not the first ones to create maps, what is important to understand is that when maps are created, oftentimes they're not accurate because way back when the technology wasn't that good, and much of the maps that were made, especially in ancient time, even in the Middle Ages, and leading and so on and so forth, they're very what we call ethnocentric. Okay, they're based upon the perspective of the cartographer, whoever's making it, and also they have certain cultural assumptions in saying, oh, this is kind of like how important our country is compared to the rest. So let me kind of give you an example. Not just Europeans, but also the Chinese. When they're establishing like their country and their kingdom, right? China in Chinese stands for Middle Kingdom, 中国. And so this is where you can see it's very ethnocentric. Their ethnicity is the center, and everything around it is kind of like secondary. The term Middle East. The term Middle East is coined by Europeans, and it's because the Europeans were known to be part of the West. Okay, and so what is east of Europe? Well, it's Asia. And so even though the Middle East is on the Asian continent, they call it the Middle East, right? Because it's the East, but not the Far East. The Far East would be China, would be Japan. Okay, but the Middle East is like that way, but not too far, right? So that's a very ethnocentric way to see the world. Europe in itself, as you can see from this physical map, it's separated from Africa by the Mediterranean Sea to the south, and also the Sahara Desert. And then you have the Urals, the Ural Mountains up on the east side. This is where the Ural Mountains separate Europe and Asia as continents. Okay, so one thing to know is that though this is the continent we are focusing on, a lot of the ideas that come out of Europe are going to be spread all across the world very widely. And so some of these ideas are positive as an influence upon the world, and I kind of mentioned this in the last intro lecture, but also it can be destructive and harming the political, social, and cultural life in wherever that is. Okay, and so ideas are going to come up like all the time throughout Europe, and a lot of them have flowed into Europe, but also out of Europe. And so European societies today still exist as a really important cross-cultural center, a place where things are exchanged, okay, especially ideas. All right. Though the experience of humans has changed vastly for the last thousands of years since recorded human history, people from the 1200s that were living on the same land as today in 2000s, right? So the geography, the topography has never changed, even though the experiences of humans has changed on the same lands. If we talk about local versus foreign, Europe was made up of a lot of like little local small pocket of units. They each had their own customs and unique culture. That's when you go to like different countries, even though it's not that far away, it's very different in some ways. Okay, they felt like they would be inclusive enough where they don't need to worry about foreigners. And a foreigner back then could be, thousands of miles away. Oh, you're from the Orient, right? That's very foreign to us. But also, because they were so localized back then, it could be 10 miles away where, the next village over would be a totally different type of personality. All right, so localism was kind of the main type of the way people lived, right? And so because it's really hard to maintain a large organization or a government even in these areas until, of course, your communication technologies can catch up, right? If we're talking about traveling across this continent, I just went this past summer, and so I went around southern Europe throughout the Mediterranean. By cruise ship that I went on, right, it's actually very fast. I can go from one port city to the next port city in about 12 hours. But back then, where they didn't have that type of technology, it's really by foot, and so people would travel at most 30 miles per day. This is before railroads, and so 30 miles is essentially, let's say, Walnut to, if you guys know where this is, Irvine. Okay, or Walnut to Riverside, that's about 30 miles. So one day, it would take a 1 day's journey. To go from London to Venice, right? From England to Italy, it would take 3 weeks. And so if you imagine if you have a pen pal, right, in one country to another, right, you write one letter, not email, not text, right, not Facebook message, you write a letter and you want to mail it, that'll take 3 weeks to get there, right? The mailman, whoever the messenger, has to deliver it back. Okay, and that starts at 6 weeks before you hear back from the other person. So it's a totally different society. So people and news traveled much slower back then as now, right? Now it's instant, right? Your push notifications on your iPhone are faster than you can actually read all of them. And so things are happening at like a 1/1000th of a second. And it's, really rich media too, really rich news. Okay, so imagine if this is just within Europe, the communication outside of Europe would be even more longer and more difficult. Okay, the European continent is known as the continent of peninsulas. Let me just kind of bring up what a peninsula is. Remember, peninsula is a land that is surrounded by water on all sides, usually 3 sides, but is still connected to a mainland. So here are some of the different peninsulas that you'll be using to label on your maps. You have the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, the Balkan Peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula, the Anatolian Peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula, the Jutland Peninsula, and the Scandinavian Peninsula. All of these are connected, right, to the mainland. They also are surrounded by water on 3 sides. Okay, so that qualifies it. And so you can imagine because there's so many peninsulas, there are a lot of port cities. Okay, and I actually went to pretty much most of them. Okay, most of them. And the point of these port cities is where trade and transportation is very easy because you just pull up, and hey, you're in a different country, and you don't have to cross over and stuff, different lands. Okay, all right. So the main place that I was on my cruise was called the Mediterranean cruise, and so the Mediterranean Sea in Latin is, I don't know Latin very well, but it's Mare Nostrum, and this means our sea, and it was coined by the Romans. So the Roman Empire gave the Mediterranean Sea this name. Some attributes are that the entrance, we call the entrance, off of the coast of Spain is the Strait of Gibraltar, and so this is an 8-mile wide opening, and because it's very, let's say, thin in terms of its opening, a lot of the ocean storms, right, are going to be subsided because of that really, really narrow strait. And so these areas, civilizations, societies of ancient times, they're going to be traveling throughout the Mediterranean because it's actually very calm. You don't have these crazy storms, although there are some times where it does get a little rougher, but it's nothing like the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and so because it's easy to navigate, to get around, obviously your trade and also migration of people is going to be very easy, and a lot of empires are going to use the Mediterranean as an avenue. Okay, so you have the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Arabic Empire, Spanish, Venetian, Ottoman Empire, so on and so forth. They're using the Mediterranean to their advantage because it's easy to navigate. Okay, so Caesarea on the Israeli coast, that's by the Middle East, what we call the Middle East or Israel. That's also a port city, and so here we are seeing that the Mediterranean is 2,400 miles long and 1,000 miles wide. Okay, so it's not that big, but what is important about it is that it is a crossroad of continents. As a sea, it actually is bigger than most. Okay, but the most important thing is that you have Europe, Asia, and Africa all touching the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so that's something that we'll be revisiting multiple times, and that's why it's important to understand the Mediterranean Sea. Let's talk about the different types of mountain ranges. Okay, so here you have the Pyrenees Mountains, which is between Spain and France, the Apennines, the Alps. People always talk about, like, the Swiss Alps and its skiing resorts and stuff. Okay, the Dinaric Mountains, the Carpathian Mountains, and the Caucasus Mountains, and the Ural Mountains. Okay, so here you have your different mountain ranges. Why is this significant? Okay, what's the point of knowing where these are? Well, the thing about mountain ranges is that because if you've ever been to the mountains, if you ever want to get over the mountain, you have to kind of go through like the winding passes and stuff. And so mountains essentially are barriers of movement. So you obviously cannot just walk through the mountain, right, as you could in terms of like just sailing through the sea. It's a barrier, right? So that means that goods, right, products, people, and ideas, three main things: goods, people, and ideas are going to hit a barrier in order, so it's difficult for those things to be transported. Okay, so you're not going to see as much people moving around because, hey, you know what? I just don't feel like climbing that mountain because it's a lot of work. Okay, France is the only country, just a fact, to be both touching the Mediterranean but also part of Northern Europe. Just a fun fact. Here is the Pyrenees, as you can see here. Okay, and as you go to any other mountain ranges around California, right? Obviously, very winding roads. It's not like you just like climb a hill and that's it. Okay, now of course with technology, with cars and railroads and even airplanes now, their mountain ranges are not as much barriers now as they were before, but that's because we just have this technology available to us. Let's talk about plains. Well, we said that mountains are barriers to movement. Plains are going to be avenues, right? So an avenue is a pathway. So that means that the three things, goods, peoples, ideas, they're actually easily transported because of the Great Plains that is basically very open and flat. So usually in the north section, north of mountains, you're going to have some plains. Okay, so the first and largest one is the Great Northern European Plain. It's this giant flat area. You're looking at parts of France. Then you have Germany, Poland. Okay, and also going into all into Russia. This is the Great Northern European Plain, and then you have the steppes. Okay, over by Ukraine, and then going all the way down to Georgia, and then you have the Siberian lowlands out in by the Urals in Russia. Okay, and these plains actually will go all the way to the Asian border. The thing to know is that from the Great Northern European Plain, this was where if invaders would want to come from Asia, it would be very easy because those barriers are not there. So for example, the Mongol Empire that came from Central Asia, they're the ones to go westward from the east, right? And they're able to penetrate all the way to the border of Central and Eastern Europe because, hey, you know what? It's just easy because it's an avenue, right? Okay, so that's plains. Remember that plains are an avenue, but also rivers. Rivers are also going to be avenues as well. Okay, rivers are obviously way more navigable because they're not rough, they're not choppy. Okay, the waves are pretty calm, and it also all the rivers are accessed to the sea. So to some greater, larger body of water, it's connected. So most of the old major cities, as we have here, London, Prague, Paris, Budapest, they are set on a river. So you have the Thames, the Vlta, Danube, and the Seine River. The purpose of it is obviously for transportation, and so rivers could then also be included with canals, right? So canals would connect rivers together, and usually canals are man-made, but then when you connect two rivers together, you pretty much can go from one country to the next by boat. Okay, and so rivers are really important, and most of the time they're gonna connect to seaports too. Okay, so rivers make it easier to travel on land because honestly, you can just row, and you can just kind of coast and let the current take you rather than you always have to walk yourself. Okay, most sorry, I didn't put these bullet points up. Most of rivers are going to be near valleys, and that's where kind of local towns, cities will develop, and the valleys are obviously places where it's fertile, right? And people will want to settle there. Okay. All right, the Danube River, just one river I want to go over. It crosses 1,700 miles, almost 1,800 miles, and it flows through 12 countries in the European Union. So you can imagine how essential even just one river is, because you can basically go to so many different countries just through sitting on a boat or a ship. Okay, then I want to talk about the different port cities. So here are really popular port cities. You have Copenhagen, Stockholm, St. Petersburg, Amsterdam, Lisbon. Okay, all of these are major port cities, and water is really important. And we talked about how Europe is a continent of peninsulas, and so having port cities is where people are actually visiting from country to country. Those are the places that they want to go to, and so because ships are going to be really common technology, right? They're going to thrive. These cities are going to thrive. All right, the climate. Climate is based upon a few things. One is the latitude, right? So latitude is like the ladder, right, going up. So depending on how north or south you are of the equator, we're talking about in the northern hemisphere now. Climate is based on latitude, ocean currents, and winds. Okay, and so as you can see from this map here, it's a climate map. It shows that much of Europe is either marine west climate or humid continental climate. And so with marine west, you kind of have a narrower range. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, and this makes up Western Europe. Humid continental is more inland. Okay, this is where it could be really humid in the summertime, and in the wintertime, you can for sure bet it's going to snow and it gets pretty cold too. So it's a little bit more extreme. The thing about understanding the climate in Europe is going to dictate a lot of the events that are happening that we're studying in history, is that in winters it's cold enough where a lot of these tropical diseases are not going to be able to thrive, and so they're going to die out if diseases do come. But also that means that if it does get cold enough in the winter, you have to bundle up, right? So you need to have more clothing. Your houses need to be insulated, and you need to have a source of heat, or else you're going to freeze to death. Yeah. So another thing about Europe is that the soil is actually very fertile, and that also indicates that there is no desert in Europe. It's actually the only continent that does not have desert in it. So every other continent has some type of desert terrain, but Europe doesn't. So it's a really great place for people to find habitation. Like they are moving to Europe because it's a place where people can reside in, right? They can settle there, and so Europe is one of the highest, densest place in population, right? There's a lot of people, but not as much land there, and so you have a lot of cities. Although we do know that Asia has the most people overall. Okay. All right, so a little bit more about latitude. We talked about how latitude dictates climate as well as one of the factors. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever seen an image like this, but this is showing that according to the latitude, and here we see in Southern California, pretty much no part of Europe experiences the same weather as we do, right? And if you were to live in England, if you live in the UK, right, you're pretty much living in Canada weather. And so I thought this was pretty crazy that pretty much all of Europe lives in a type of like northern United States, southern Canada type of climate year-round. Okay, so they don't experience like our nice 70 degrees year-round temperature, and in the summers get a little hot for us. It's dry, but not so much over there. Okay, let's talk about the major regions. Okay, we have Northern Europe. We're going to have Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and these are the ones that, like, when I refer to Western Europe, these are the countries generally. Okay, and then we also have some other smaller regions that are still important that do identify parts of Europe. It's going to be Central Europe and Southern Europe, and so as you study for your map quiz, very simply, you'll be acquainted with which countries are within which region of Europe. Okay, all right. Lastly, I do want to mention a few things. Is that we talked about the diversity of Europeans, and as you know, okay, in America we speak English, right? That's the main official language. But in Europe, right, it's going to be very diverse, and it is not just based upon this map, but it's rooted from ancient civilizations a long time ago from the Indo-European. So back a long time ago, okay, you have the Indo-Europeans that lived, and they spoke generally kind of under the same branch, and slowly it spread over and it diversified in Europe, in the Middle East, and in India, but they originally were from one rooted language. Now that's crazy to imagine, but that was thousands and thousands of years ago, and obviously things have changed now, where you can imagine many people from Northern Europe are not really going to understand people from Southern Europe and East and West and stuff. Okay, what is important to know is kind of the different regions. Now, if you look at Romance languages, not because it's very romantic sounding as much as girls think that French is so romantic. Romance meaning that it's coming from the Roman Empire, which is stemming from Latin roots. Okay, so a lot of you sophomores will be learning about Latin roots this year, which is pretty cool because you'll use it to your advantage. Okay, so one thing to know is that these different ethnicities that are stemming from these languages, right? You have Albanian, Slavic, Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Greek, so on and so forth. They have their own customs. So you can imagine how they call something Um, I could be wrong, but gelato in Italy, right? But then when I went to Spain, right, they call it helado, and so it's very similar because they're both Romance languages, but at the same time, like the terminology that they may use in each area and each region is going to be different because of the people groups that live within there. Okay, so keep studying for your map quiz. Okay, I hope that as you're building this map, you're very getting more acquainted with it.